Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, of Mice and Men, I'm very excited to start talking to you guys about this. One of my all time favorite stories. And I've mentioned this before. Um, I have probably read through this book by teaching it, I don't know, 30 times. I've read it a few times on my own. I remember reading it the first time when I was in high school, just out of interest's sake, I think. But I love it. It's such a great story, and I never get tired of it. So, it is written by John Steinbeck, who's got that sweet little mustache there. There is a really good movie version of it, and we'll talk about that later on. But let's talk about the author for just a minute to understand a little bit about who he is, and then we'll talk about the historical context for this story, and then we'll talk a little bit about the characters. So, Steinbeck is considered one of the great American writers of the 20th century. He has written many books, many of which are extremely famous. Of Mice and Men is one of them. His probably most famous book is called The Grapes of Wrath. And then The East of Eden, not The East, just East of Eden, is probably one of his other most famous books. Many of his books have been turned into plays and movies. And so he was a very successful writer and well known throughout American literature. So he was born here in California, in Salinas. We'll talk about that in just a minute, in 1902. So this is going back quite a long ways. But of course, he loved where he grew up. He grew up near the Pacific Ocean, and just the beauty, the natural beauty of the hills and the ocean, they just really touched Steinbeck's soul. And I think it worked its way into so much of his writing. And then Steinbeck would also spend his summers as a hired farm worker on nearby ranches. So I think this gave him a peek into many different types of lives that he was able to draw from to inspire his writing later on in his life. Introduced him to a lot of different kind of characters, kind of people who would develop into his stories. So, the Fields of Salinas. If you have ever been to Salinas, California, raise your hand. Haha, it's a joke because this is a recorded video. Beautiful hills, and then lots of fields for growing of crops and such. So Salinas, there's right in the central coast of California. We are way down here in Orange County, and we're going to talk about the city of Weed, which is way up here in a little bit. Weed, everyone laughs because they think it's like, a different kind of weed, but no, it's the name of a city. And you can go there and you can get a shirt that says, "I love weed." Talking about the city of California. I actually went and drove through Weed 2 summers ago. And so you can see here's a sign. It says Weed. Anyway, that's me, and that's the sign. And it was an awesome trip. So anyway, moving right along. The Salinas Valley is sometimes referred to as the salad bowl of the world because it grows a vast quantity of crops, foods. We got pictures of lettuce here. It grows so many different types of produce, raisins, and just oranges and all kinds of stuff. So lots of farm work to be had in Salinas. In fact, I believe California produces so much produce that we supply just a huge, huge percentage of the United States. And I think we send a bunch even to Mexico of our produce. So it's beautiful. I love these pictures. This is our country. This is our state. We are so lucky. So pretty. Look at those hills. Look at them. Because Steinbeck is going to write about them, and he does an amazing job. Just love it. I think it's so wonderful. Okay, so Steinbeck pretty early on knew he wanted to be a writer. He did attend Stanford University, but he never graduated because he would take a few classes and drop out and take a few classes and drop out. In fact, I know one time he took a science class, a biology class rather, where there was dissecting a human being. But he was a literature major, and he was asked, like, "What are you doing in this class?" He's like, "I want to see how the body works, because if I'm going to write about it, I want to know what's in it." So anyway, he was just fascinating with a lot of things, and really did his best to study and know what was going on. And so to that end, he would even work with migrant workers or these Bindlestiffs. Now, today in California, most migrant workers are going to be Mexican or South American workers, and they literally migrate. They will start in one place and they slowly work their way to different farms and different villages throughout the season. They pick crops, and then they go back home. So, when we think of migrant workers today in California, we might think of Mexicans. And in John Steinbeck's time, there was a fair amount of that. In fact, one of his stories, he writes about the paisanos. Um, so, but there also would have been plenty of kind of white American men as well that would be these migrant workers. And so they are sometimes referred to as Bindlestiffs. And we're going to talk more about the historical context in just a minute. But often, these were guys who were out of work, and their entire belongings they would carry on their backs. So you see these guys with a blanket roll, a suitcase, or excuse me, a sleeping bag, maybe a couple of pairs of clothes, and that was it. And they would just walk along the roads. And these are the Bindlestiffs. And so as we get into the story, George and Lenny, they are a couple of Bindlestiffs. These guys who carry their entire worldly belongings with them from one place to another as they work from farm to farm. So technically, these are homeless people. All right. So coming back to Steinbeck, he wrote a bunch of novels that were very famous. Not going to spend too much time about that, but as I mentioned, he was a very popular, well-known author. And so I hope you read some of his other books as well someday. He died in 1968. He was living in New York City at that time. It's a little bit complicated because he felt like his native people, his kind of group in California, kind of turned their backs on him. So he did move out. But he was buried in Salinas because that's, when you read his writing, you can tell that's where his heart was. And so it's actually considered Steinbeck country today in a very loving sense. And you can go visit the Steinbeck Center. I have never been there yet. I still want to go. It's on my to-do list. But anyway, and you can even see here's the picture of the paisanos that he would write about. All right, so let's talk briefly about Of Mice and Men. It starts, well, technically it doesn't start off in Weed, but George and Lenny, they do start in Weed, and then they catch a train and walk all the way down to Salinas, where they are looking for work. So we're talking about people who are homeless and who are broke. They have no money, and what they want to do is roll up a steak. Not talking like a big old meaty steak, but a steak, which means something that they can hold on to, something that they can grasp. They want some money that they can make their own. So many of the characters in the story are basically going to be very poor. Like I said, migrant farm workers that would work from farm to farm. And so Of Mice and Men is dealing with this idea. Okay, now let's talk about setting this in the historical context. Let's see here. Did I skip a little bit here? Let's go ahead and jump here to the historical context. Okay, migrant workers, they would walk from farm to farm, planting and harvesting crops. And they would just go from farm to farm, and they would get a job. And when that job ended, they would move on to the next. When that job ended, they would move on to the next. So not getting paid an awful lot. And here's the thing. The story is set in the 1930s. And if you know anything about history, you know in 1929 was the massive major stock market crash. And the United States economy just crashed. And what happened is a lot of people lost their jobs. And because they lost their jobs, they lost their homes. And because they lost their homes, they were now homeless. And so a lot of people got in their cars and they came west to California. There was a whole other element of it called the Dust Bowl, where a massive drought in the center of the United States was just destroying crops. And so because of a number of reasons, these farmers, they just couldn't survive. And so a lot of them headed west to California for work. So in this story, George and Lenny are migrant workers, and they've been given cards which allow them to work cards, and they are able to travel to jobs that have allowed them to come and work. Um, so here's the thing. We have this phrase called the American dream. And what it means is that anybody can move to the United States, get a good job, and earn enough money to have a comfortable, nice living arrangement and have their family and live in peace. It's a very nice dream. And so the idea is that anyone can immigrate to the United States. Anyone can come here from anywhere in the world. And if you work hard, if you do things right, you too can have your own house. You can have your wife or your husband. You can have your couple of kids. You can have your dog and your white picket fence, and you can have a nice, comfortable life. That's the dream, the American dream. We sometimes call it the promise of America. Come, immigrants, come, you poor people, and work hard and raise yourself up to a better economic situation. It's the dream. Now, the truth of that is some people do work hard, and yet they still work in poverty. They still live in poverty, excuse me. Some people do work hard, and yet they still have trouble. And so this is a long time discussion of the American dream throughout history. And what Steinbeck starts to look at here in his book is the American dream and what happens to those who have the dream and how do you achieve the dream. So the basic idea is this: work hard and you too can have a nice, comfortable life. You can earn enough money to buy your own home and to live the way you want to live, which is a pretty dang good dream. So Steinbeck is going to be exploring that in this story. Let's jump back now to our main characters here. So we have George Milton, who is this guy here. And as I've previously mentioned, he's kind of the smaller guy. He's smart, but he's physically a little bit smaller. And Lenny Small, small, get it? Small. Lenny is a huge dude, okay? Just a mountain of a man. Strong as an ox, they say. So the problem with Lenny is that he has a child's mentality, maybe the mindset of a 5 or 6 year old. He just never really develops mentally. We might call him mentally retarded today, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean in the mentally handicapped way. Okay? But George takes care of Lenny. And so they go around together. George looks out for him, and they go from farm to farm, and they are working together. Okay. Now, here's where the mice come into play in the story, because Lenny likes to pet soft things. And so he pets mice. He'll hold them and he'll pet them. That's about the extent of mice in Of Mice and Men. Okay. We've already talked about the title. There's not a lot of mice in the story. He just likes to pet them. That's it. Lenny likes to pet soft mice. Okay. George and Lenny both have a dream that they will get a farm together. And Lenny loves this dream. So here's George. George is physically smaller, still a strong dude, but he's the guy who kind of has the brains of their relationship. He says he's not very smart, but he's smart enough to take care of Lenny. He talks about not having to have Lenny. He says, my life would be so much better if I didn't have to worry about you. But you can also tell that George really loves Lenny. Okay? And again, his dream is to earn some money so that he and Lenny can buy a house together and they can have that American dream and kind of live that happily ever after kind of life. All right, so those are the two main characters. We got Lenny Small and George Milton. And the setting, as I mentioned, is in Salinas, which is very close to the California coast. And I encourage you to travel there someday and visit it. It's a pretty awesome place. All right. So Soledad is the city. In fact, the beginning of the story starts off with a few miles south of Soledad. The Salinas River drops in close to the hillside banks and runs deep and green. Okay, California, 1930s. Again, most of the country was dealing with massive economic fallout. California was actually pretty untouched. The migrant workers were able to work, the farms were working, and people were still working for this American dream where anybody could achieve their goals. But still, for a lot of people, they were out of work. And so this dream of having a little house and a couple of acres, a lot of people had that dream and hoped to be able to make a better life for themselves and for their families. Some of the other things that we will see in this story, the theme of loneliness. So pay attention when a character seems lonely. This idea of power or powerlessness. Who holds the power? Who controls the situation? Destiny. And then, of course, some of the ideas of discrimination based on gender, because there is a woman. We'll talk about her, and I love what we do with her name. So we'll talk about that later on. Race and age and disability, all of these things Steinbeck talked about in Of Mice and Men. So he was kind of ahead of his time. All right, some of the other characters that we're going to go over very quickly, and I don't want you to get confused. Candy is not a woman. Everyone goes, Candy is a stripper. No, I don't know why you guys think that. Candy is just a very old man. Okay, he's an old man. In fact, he only has one hand because the other hand got caught in a mill, and so he's got one good hand and then just a nub for his other hand. His name is Candy. Curly, he's kind of the punk in the story. He's got curly hair. Get it? Curly hair. And then we have Curly's wife. We'll talk about her much more later on. I'm just going to leave that there for now. But she's the one woman in this book, Curly's wife. Crooks has a crooked back. Okay? Get it? Crooks, crooked back. He is the one black man in this story. And we'll talk about him later on as well. Slim is not the boss, but he's kind of like the second in command. Slim is respected by all the men. He's kind of like a middle manager. You got the boss, and then you got Slim, and then you got everybody else. So Slim is important. Carlson, he's just one of the other guys. So not that important. All right. So that's kind of your introduction to Of Mice and Men, some of the background. So, all right. I can't wait to start reading this, you guys. Take care. Until next time, sayonara.